Now let's zoom out again and let's answer the next question. In what state would you say more tornadoes have occurred than any other? This is probably the most basic and first question that you think of when you look at this kind of data. You know, so often we think of Kansas, which is right here, as being sort of a hot spot for tornadoes. Maybe that goes back to, the old Wizard of Oz movie. But is that necessarily the case? In what 3 states would you say more tornadoes have occurred than any other? Now, part of it has to do with area, right? So when you look at an area like the size of Texas, indeed Texas might have the most tornadoes of any of these states in the data set. So what state would you say has the most tornadoes? Now let's think about density. Yeah, there's a lot of tornadoes in Kansas, and as we zoom in, we'll see more of them. But in terms of density, I'm thinking Oklahoma might be the densest place in terms of the density of tornadoes. Take a look at this. This is incredible. Now use the measure tool to measure the distance between some of these. Do you want it in miles? Well, that's fine. Now let's go ahead and measure. There's 20 miles between those. There's only 8 miles between those tornadoes. So you go ahead and do the same thing and measure the distance between these tornadoes in the data set, remembering that scale matters. And so as you zoom in, you'll see more tornadoes. What are the top 3 states in your judgment that have experienced the most tornadoes? Now let's take a look at density, as we have been. In what 3 states would you say that the tornado density is the highest? I'm thinking Oklahoma. What do you think? Name 3 large cities that you think are most at risk for severe tornadoes. Thinking about the Fujita scale once again. Use the search box to look up the following 3 cities. Kansas City, Missouri, Oklahoma City, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. Here's Oklahoma City. Get rid of that search box and that measure box. And here are the tornadoes in and around Oklahoma City. Interesting. There's a lot of tornadoes just within the city limits, haven't there been? In the lesson, I have something where you can determine this, and then you're going to, as you can see here, write down the number of tornado touchdowns within 20 miles of the city center. So you'll have to use the measure tool, and then write down the number of tornado touchdowns that you record in Kansas City, Oklahoma City, and Minneapolis. Compare and contrast tornado damage in a rural area now versus an urban area. We often hear about urban damage to towns and cities, where tornadoes have blazed through all kinds of structures. But what about rural damage? What kind of rural damage is most destructive, and why? Find a tornado that occurred close to any of the coasts. Aha, let's go down to the coast. How about the Gulf Coast? That'll be interesting. It looks to me like a lot of tornadoes have actually occurred right along the coasts, and indeed a couple of them have been off the coasts. Is it possible for a tornado to begin in the water? How can this happen? Change the base map now to shaded relief. What effect do mountains have on the frequency of tornadoes? So if I shade it, I've changed the base map now to shaded relief. I'm going to go ahead and zoom out here. Now I'm going to go ahead and look at the Ozarks. It looks to me that, there's quite a few tornadoes down there in Arkansas. What about the Ozarks? There's a slightly less number in these higher parts of the Ozarks. Interesting. What about the Rocky Mountains? Let's go ahead and look at Colorado. Okay, some tornadoes out on the eastern plains, but not very many in the mountains. There are a few, but not all that many. There's an effect of terrain that seems to have a negative effect on tornadoes. Why is that? Do some investigations and find out. What effect does latitude have on the frequency of tornadoes? So let's go ahead and compare where we've been looking to a place like North Dakota. Okay, there are some tornadoes up in North Dakota. Seems like a little bit less, though, than Oklahoma. Why is that? During what decade do you estimate that more tornadoes occurred than any other, based on this map? Next phase of the investigation now. Tornadoes not only touch down, as represented by these points, but one of the reasons they are so destructive is that they move across the landscape in a track. Zoom in until you see tornado tracks. See those arrows? those are the tracks of the different tornadoes. Fascinating. Seems like almost a random pattern up here. Let's enter Shawnee, Oklahoma. Now we're looking at Shawnee. I'm going to change the base map to a light gray canvas again, so I don't see all that topographic map information behind it. Now I can clearly see the vectors. Looks like many of them moved from the southwest to the northeast in this area. Why is that? Do some investigation on air masses and the jet stream, for example. As you'll find out, in North America, most of the time winds occur, they blow from west to east. Seems like the southwest to northeast trend here reflects that pattern. Let's do some measuring again, and let's measure a couple of these tracks. There's a 9.7 mile tornado. Investigate some of these others in a similar way. Estimate the average distance for the tornado tracks in this area, using at least 6 tornadoes in your calculation. Okay, then compare it to a place like Elkhart, Indiana. Wow, it seems like some of the tornadoes in Elkhart are a bit longer than the ones we looked at in Shawnee. But there are some shorter ones too. Remember, this is real-world data, and it's not all going to fall into one nice, neat, little happy category. There's all kinds of variability, which is one of the reasons why examining real-world data is so fascinating. Using the scale bar, estimate the average distance for the tornado tracks in this area also, using at least 6 tornadoes in your calculation. Can you find a location where the primary direction that the tornado tracks move is radically different from the locations you have already examined? Explain at least 3 reasons why the tornado tracks move in the direction they do. Remember, we've got the capability here in a GIS to examine imagery as a base map. So, for example, we can really zoom in on some of these locations. So, for example, in this particular area, we can look at the land use. So this particular tornado looks like it crossed really close to this particular airport in Elkhart, Indiana. What could have been in the hazard there? And look at the different kinds of land use and land cover that it crossed over. Some fields, but some subdivisions, some houses. What about other tornadoes in other areas? Where did they cross? Why are they destructive? Here's one that went right across the urban area in 2001, that particular one. Wow. So there are some really localized investigations that you could do. For example, this particular tornado touched down right here. What field did it touch down? Again, recognizing that you might be using data that was collected at one scale, but now you're zoomed way into a large scale. This particular tornado might have been old. It might have been from, indeed, it was from 1965. How much confidence do we have in the exact spatial location of that tornado? It may have been in this general area. We don't know exactly that it was right there. It may have been, but it may not have been. So, for example, if it was sighted on this road and someone reported that it touched down right there, well, then we have a fairly accurate representation. But maybe in this town over here, someone said, you know what, that tornado occurred off to the southeast, and so it was plotted there by the National Weather Service way back in the 1960s. But we don't know exactly that it was right there. But for tornadoes that are more recent, we actually do know exactly their latitude and longitude to a certain precision. Now, finally, write your own question about tornadoes in the USA and answer it. So this is just a brief tour through this particular lesson. This particular lesson, once again, is investigating historical tornadoes using ArcGIS Online. Thanks.
I hope that investigation has piqued your interest, that you really want to dig into this now on your own. You can add more questions, and you can change the scale. You can look at different regions, all using ArcGIS Online, a web browser-based GIS from Esri. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts about how you have investigated tornadoes spatially from a geographic perspective using online GIS. Thanks.